Hi all, as I'm recording this, Gen Con 2024 is going to start in just a couple days, and it occurred to me that I went to my first Gen Con in 1984, and I went to every one since until I finally missed one in 2023. That's an awful lot of Gen Cons, awful lot of memories, and it's been interesting watching Gen Con change over time. So if you should somehow have gotten to this video without knowing what Gen Con is North America's largest tabletop gaming oriented convention. It started in 1968 in Lake Geneva. A few hundred people meeting in the VFW hall, the horticultural hall, whatever it was. Somebody can go look up that history and correct me. Finally, in 1985, they moved to Milwaukee. It was the Mecca Convention Center. Eventually became, I think it was the Midwest Event Center. But Gen Con outgrew that at about 25,000 people. In 2003, it moved to Indianapolis and started making use of the Indiana Convention Center, and nowadays also Lucas Oil Stadium and all the hotels in the area. The attendance in 2023 was listed as 70,000. And just to get some perspective, if you've not been to a gaming convention and you hear 70,000 people, when you talk about 70,000 people at a gaming convention, you're saying most of them are there every day, most of the day. So there's a whole lot of people there. Unlike a lot of conventions people are used to, like if you go to the auto show, you probably go for a few hours on one day and that's it. And so you see these huge attendance figures, but it's not like they were there all day, every day. So I want to take a minute to kind of look and think about and talk about what has changed with Gen Con over time. The first thing that occurs to me about what has changed is simply size. In 1984, it was the last year at University of Wisconsin Parkside. The attendance I see when I try to look it up says about 3,600 people, which is, a decent sized convention by today's standards. Back then it was huge. And as I said earlier, that, in 2023 they had 70,000 people. It's like having a large town or a small city dropped into a few block area in the middle of Indianapolis. But what does that size really mean for Gen Con compared to, let's say, going to a convention with 3,600 people? Bigger crowds mean that they can really appeal to all kinds of little niches in the gaming. The odds are, if you're interested in some kind of game, somebody is running it at Gen Con. The bigger crowd also means you get a whole host of other things that are just kind of peripherally related to gaming, things that gamers might be interested in. And I just tried to make a quick list of things, and I went, well, there's the game auction that's going on in the auction store. There's, of course, a ton of cosplay going on. It gets a lot of attention, a lot of pictures taken. That's just kind of a small part of what's going on there. There's like a sci-fi film room going on, an anime film room going on. There's the block party. There's live entertainment roaming the halls and doing things. There's a whole set of now children's programming so that whole families can come and you've got a place your children have things to do and maybe a place for you to park your children so you can go off to do some event for a little while that's been really carefully put together and thought through, and even a whole host of should we say non-gamer spouse related programming, a whole set of things that give people who are not strictly related to gaming but maybe they're there with other people who are, something for them to look at and do. So the size just gives them that huge ability to put on all kinds of different things and appeal to a whole bunch of different interests within tabletop gaming. If you're at a smaller con, you're not going to get all those different kinds of things. You're going to certainly get a lot of D&D, but as soon as you get beyond that in role playing, it's called what's hot right now. You'll probably get a little of that playing on, but if you want to get somebody who's playing some game that was published back in the 90s to do whatever, you're going to be a lot less likely to find that at a small con, unless maybe you yourself run it to encourage people to get there. Another thing that's changed over time is, quite frankly, the people who attend. In 1984, when I went, let's just say my wife was probably one of the very few women that were there. It was very definitely a male-dominated environment. By the late 80s or early 90s, that was noticeably changing, and probably by the early 2000s, it was really kind of close to parity. It was very nice to see that change happen over time. Also, with that change, you get more families at Gen Con. let's face it, back in the 80s, gamers were a rare breed, but today you've got a lot of gamers who've grown up being raised by gamers. So you have whole families being at Gen Con now, where before it was pretty much, the guys got together to play some games, play some D&D, play some whatever else was going on. So it's been interesting to watch that change go on, and the greater diversity and the greater inclusion of all kinds of people, all kinds of interests in gaming at the convention that has attracted a huge number of people there. The vendor hall has certainly seen some change over time. I honestly don't recall the vendor hall from 1984. I'm sure I was there, but I just do not recall it. In the first year in Milwaukee, Gen Con really only used part of the Mecha Hall. There was some other show going on there at the same time. So if you've only been to a modern Gen Con, you have no idea just how much smaller it was. But I used to be able to cover the entire vendor hall every day and still have plenty of time to do a lot of other things, play various games, do whatever. And that's much harder to do today. I mean, the vendor hall at the modern Gen Con is probably, what, 1.5 city blocks? It's huge. Another change that's kind of gone over time is, I mean, it used to be back in the 80s and 90s, is you really had, all the booths were various distributors, I should say distributors, actually publishers. They were the people who put out the games. And if you were at a booth, you were probably talking to some of the actual business people from the company. You were talking to the actual designers. You were talking to all those people. Today, a lot of the booths are more the distributors, they're various hobby shops, various whatever, and of course a whole host of peripheral things that are not directly gaming, but a whole host of things. And I appreciate those things, but, it used to be, if I wanted to find such and such a game, such and such a new game, I would go to that publisher's booth. Now I find that sometimes there's whatever brand new games are out, and they're in 5 or 6 or 7 different booths because of all the different, like I said, distributors or whatever that are there. In some ways, that's good. Always nice to have a little competition, and it might help with the price a little bit. But on the other hand, it means there's a bit more of a layer between you and talking to that guy who runs the company, talking to that designer, without necessarily, in some places, getting into a line and having to wait to talk to them. You can still get a bit of that full feel. There's that whole stretch now in the vendor hall called Entrepreneurs Avenue, I think is what they call it, and it's a bunch of smaller booths with guys who have, their new game out. They've got their one game, their 2 games, and often sometimes you'll see some of them sharing a booth. So that still has that old feel where you can actually talk to the guys who designed it. The person who's showing you the game is the guy who wrote it, and you have that little different feel. There was also this strange period I'm remembering back, probably more in the 80s, where there were some booths that had booth babes. And I do recall the first year that you had some booths that were selling some chainmail stuff, which included like a chainmail bikini top. It was certainly be large crowds of young men around those booths because a couple of the women in the booth wearing the chainmail bikini top. It's nice to kind of see that era pass and get back more to a time where, like I said, again, you're gamers talking to gamers kind of thing in the vendor hall. As I said earlier, one of the advantages of that huge convention now, the 70,000 people, is just about, like I said, if you want to play a certain game, you can probably find somebody running it there somewhere. Back in 1984, I don't have clear memories. I really went there to play D&D. So there was plenty of D&D going on. There were probably a few board games things going on, a few other things, but it still, it was much more focused on a few kinds of games. And that kind of probably really kind of didn't change much until sometime in the early 90s. And, I some of us will recall that, this certain year in the early 90s where this new card game seemed to take over all the open gaming areas, and, oh God, people were just picking up a spot on the floor to play the game, and you were trying hard not to trip over them, and it annoyed a few of the old guard who had trouble finding place if they wanted some open gaming space to play something of their own, or just, all these card players, and this card game will just be a flash in the panel, go away. And of course, how many years later now, Magic the Gathering is still going strong. Like I said, today, if anybody's playing it, the odds are really high that it's being run at Gen Con. Yeah, you can support some very small niches when 70,000 people get together with that kind of an interest. RPGs and LARPs of all kinds of genres and generations fill all of the all of the exhibition space in the hotels around the convention center. Almost all the role playing is out in the hotels around the convention center. The board games and card games take over a large chunk of the convention center itself. And then, several years ago, it moved over into also using a lot of space on the field at the at Lucas Oil Stadium. So again, with that much space being devoted just to playing games, there's a ton of games being played. And like I said, if you want to play it, it's probably there somewhere. And of course nowadays you have True Dungeon down there, and I like to put it down in the hallways underneath the field. That makes it sound a little more catacombish than it really is. But you have things like the True Dungeon. There's a whole room set aside that's just for if you want to play test some new games. There's guys there who are developing their new games, and you can sit down and play games and answer questions for them and help them develop a better game. There's room for that. And if I have one bit of advice on that, it's called, if there's something you want to play and you can't find it on the schedule, next year, run it yourself. And then it'll be on the schedule and you'll get a chance to do it. Many events are run by the publishers, but many more events are run just by people who want to run the game. It's really just not that hard to put on an event at Gen Con. And if you really want to do something, I suggest you check it out. Some final thoughts. I mean, when I first went to Gen Con, it was to play Dungeons and Dragons, but to play games in general. Eventually, as I got to know some people there, nice thing about a small con, you get to run into some of the same people year after year. You get to know them. There's those friends you meet once a year. So that became a bigger and bigger part of what I do. And over time, what I go to Gen Con for has changed from being largely role-playing to largely being board games. There's years I've just spent time taking a lot of pictures. So there's a lot of stuff just to experience and run around and take pictures. 6 or 7 years ago, we started running some events at Gen Con. Over time, like I said, my experience of Gen Con has changed, and that's one of the nice things about a big con like that is you can do different things. As the years go by, you can kind of change and grow with it. But there's always a but, right? As Gen Con grew, it seems to be more and more. It's an event as opposed to just a game convention. And several years ago, I started to attend some other gaming conventions. I know that's probably scandalous to some of you. And eventually, I came to understand the difference quite simply. Is I go to Gen Con now. Nowadays, I go to Gen Con to see things. I go to the other conventions to play games. It's not that I don't play games at Gen Con, but that's not the main focus there. There's so much going on, so much. So many new things being rolled out that are time for Gen Con. So much, just like I said, I had that whole list of other non-game stuff going on. That there's a whole lot to distract you. And so it is a great place for me to go and be able to play some of those little niche things I want to do that's harder to do at a local convention. But there's something about the pace there that's an issue. This all kind of came to a head for me in 2022. It was Thursday afternoon, heading into the vendor hall. If for those of you who know Gen Con, you're kind of going Thursday afternoon. That's going to be when the vendor hall's quietest and least crowded. And about 15 feet from the door, I just suddenly came to a stop because there was this wall of sound coming out, and I really am quite a big introvert, and dealing with all those people and all that sound can be a little bit much. And as I get older, it takes a little more effort to deal with. And it was just really weird to come to a halt and go, okay, this is something I've done for 30 some years. Why am I being reluctant now? And I pulled out my noise canceling headphones and popped them in, put a little music and headed into the hall and had a perfectly fine time. But there was that realization that my relationship with the convention has changed. And now, this is not really as big a deal as I'm trying to make it sound, but it really highlighted to me that my relationship with the convention has changed, and I was getting more joy attending the smaller conventions. even though they often didn't have some of those more niche things I wanted to do, the pace and whatever was different, and I just was more comfortable there. I also like running into some of the same people year after year, or even table after table, that I stop experiencing at Gen Con now that it's just so big it doesn't happen. But at a smaller con, you get to kind of know people and you get a chance to talk to them. So in many ways, it was really kind of a relief in 2023 when my niece's wedding popped up, and I just didn't have to plan for Gen Con. It was a nice change. People online predictably tried to come up with all kinds of scenarios about how I could make it to Gen Con and my niece's wedding, and I quietly didn't say that part of the point for me was it was actually kind of nice to take a break. Gen Con had almost become an annual obligation, and I was really happy to break the streak and remove that obligation and make now my choice to go to Gen Con be, hey, let's go to Gen Con this year, as opposed to we have to go to Gen Con every year. So I do intend to get back at some point, but that point does not include 2024. There are some other things going on in my life that would have made that difficult this year, but it would have been certainly possible. But again, it was nice. The obligation was removed, and I can deal with those other things instead of whatever. So, some real simple advice. If you are a gamer and you have never been to Gen Con, find a way to get there sometime. You'll be impressed by this huge gathering of the clan. There's just nothing like it. And I really think if you really are a big gamer, experiencing that at least once is a good thing. And you may find it becomes your annual trip for many, many years. If you go to Gen Con but have not gone to other smaller cons, find some time to go to your smaller cons, your smaller local cons, and support them. Trust me, there will be plenty of games to play. They may not fill all those little niches you might want them to fill, but there will be plenty of things to do there. The pace is different, and each one kind of has its own special little feel that's just a little bit different. So please feel free to comment down below on Gen Con memories, or if there's some special small local con you'd like to kind of highlight. I would really love to see a comment like that. Also, please feel free to like and subscribe, and thanks for your time.